Let ideas come freely. Don't question them. When something resonates and I'm just like, this is just a cool idea, find a way to justify it being a part of the story. I have to see what ideas actually stick with me artistically and then create worlds around them.
If you're like me and you love those film, game, TV scores that feel completely immersive, then what does it actually take as a composer to create your own dark fantasy world? How do you go from these new ideas and sketches to a world that feels like it can live and breathe on its own? I sat down with my friend Zach Heyde to talk about how he nurtured just a few raw ideas into The Call of Raven's Hollow, and it is by far some of the most immersive fantasy music I've ever heard. But I think for a lot of composers out there, there's one habit that can get in the way of keeping these ideas alive, and it completely kills our momentum. For the past few years, I've been a tutor for the Orchestral Composition Bootcamp from ThinkSpace Education. And I've gotten to talk with and help a ton of different composers who are all pretty much trying to do one thing with their music. If it's, for film, TV, games, theater, concert music, and it's to tell a story. And when we actually get down to the heart of it, there's one thread that pretty much shows up all the time, and it's this feeling like your music isn't good enough. Maybe it's not professional enough, you don't like the way it sounds, so we do everything that we can to try and figure out how we can make it right. We look for the best sample libraries, we buy new ones that we hope might fix our music. We get caught up in building a new template and trying to make it perfect, make sure it's well balanced. Maybe we try and find how other people have theirs set up. Maybe back in school, music theory was drilled into you by a professor or other students saying that your music had to be done professionally or the right way.
There's certain ideas that go around in our space that always kind of made me chuckle. Like, for example, people getting obsessed about parallel motion in music. People going, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's not allowed. That's such a funny statement to me. And people getting really locked into the theory. And I understand it. I actually empathize with it to an extent, because part of it is like, if we can't set rules with music, how the heck do we make any decisions at all, like you said? So a lot of the way that people cope with that lack of direction when it comes to music making is to latch onto rules. And then when you see someone breaking those rules, it's like an ego break. So you're like, you can't do that. Like, if you can do that, then that means I can do that, and that means all the rules that I have as a composer like go out the window.
Somewhere in there, we almost forgot why we started writing. What was it that made us fall in love with it in the first place? I think it's gonna be different for everybody, but for me, it's just always been story. I've always obsessed how film music and storytelling can come together. As a kid, I always had this sense of curiosity and creativity. It naturally dies away as we get older, the more that we start looking for validation from others. Maybe it's validation from other composers, other people in our field, maybe on social media, for someone to say, hey, you're a good composer, that's really good writing. But then at the same time, we dread someone criticizing our music, the thing that is so close to us. Someone to say like, hey, you can't do that, or your mix is off. Maybe we're actively looking for work, and that validation comes in the form of a composing gig. And so in a way, that gig almost represents the value of the art. And personally, there was a moment where all of this just made me stop composing, or I would procrastinate, I would find excuses not to write. So I ended up forgetting what made me feel good about composing, which was the story behind it. And I think that's the trap. It's chasing the right way to do things based on external validation, so much so that we don't end up writing the music we want to write, tell the stories we want to tell. And so our music, the work that we do, the art doesn't feel aligned.
So I was always looking for validation for my decisions as a composer from the people I admired. And then one day I just kind of realized, like, everybody does stuff differently. There are no right answers. So why don't I just trust that if it feels good for me, then it's right? And just build more self-trust around that process instead of constantly searching out for validation for my decision making.
I can't tell you how many early ideas I have that are sitting on my phone as a voice note or on my hard drive as just like a blank session with like a couple of MIDI notes. I convince myself that, oh, you know what, this just isn't a good idea. This can't become anything. So the question is, how do we actually keep the spark alive and actually become something and nurture it into something that can grow into like a world in itself? When Zach was at the very start of the writing process, he really gave himself time to focus on letting those new ideas breathe. He gave himself the permission to just sit down and explore. Whether or not it was right or wrong, whether or not it got the validation from other people, it was just him and the art. There was no outline for the hollow. He wasn't trying to define the entire thing right out of the gate. Instead, there was this complete saturation process where he just surrounded himself with all the things he loved, the style he was trying to go for. So dark fantasy, Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, and then he was able to let the ideas that excited him stick. The point of all this isn't to just sit in front of your DAW and just hope that inspiration comes, you know? It's to give yourself the space to live in the potential of what this fantasy world could look like. Now, if you're familiar with Zach, he's been on YouTube for a very long time, and it's been really cool to see the evolution of his studio. He rebuilt the space around the feeling that he was trying to capture. So he got himself a black robe, he got the typewriter, a fog machine. These were all the rituals that made the process feel realistic and enjoyable. So maybe light a candle with a very specific scent, or figure out the proper lighting in your environment. Figure out how you can create stories for these characters that you're hearing. And the funny thing is, once all that non-musical stuff is in place, you know, for a musician, maybe it might initially seem counterproductive or like a distraction. You'll notice that the music can come much more naturally.
Many of the things I did on this album, I had to overcome the fear of wasted time component a lot to be able to make it work, because writing a story on a typewriter does not serve my productivity engine in the slightest, but it might serve the art in giving me that space and getting the ideas to come out.
And I think that's the fun part, just figuring out what it is that inspires you. So for me, I actually surrounded myself with all the things that reminded me of music in the first place. So in the corner, I have Paradise Falls from Up. I have some cool sheet music art hanging up on the wall. In the back of the room, I have maps and fantasy books, Funko Pops, all the things that make me feel like a kid again. And that's why I relate to Zach's process so much, because growing up, I wanted to be a filmmaker or an artist, a writer, an actor. I would draw maps and create characters and come up with different stories and lore and magic systems. Back then, and actually to this day, my favorite part about physical media was the second disc that came with the movie, because of all the special features and the behind the scenes. I can't tell you how many times I watched the making of Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Back to the Future, Spider-Man. All of that inspired my love of storytelling, world building, and the stories that I would create have always stuck with me, you know? And I just never knew exactly how to share them. Now, music is just one way I've learned to do that, but I think that's why I've been so inspired by Michael Giacchino as an example. He's not only a composer, but he is a director. He's written comic books. He is a storyteller at the core. He takes on the projects of the characters and the worlds that he loved as a kid, so Star Trek and Spider-Man, Planet of the Apes. So for me as a composer, I want to surround myself with the stuff that actually keeps me inside the world. I care so much more about that now than if my mock-up sounds realistic or not, or if I'm using proper voicings or, you know, the right counterpoint. I just want to enjoy the process of exploration again. And if you feel the same way, then you might want to pick up my Storytelling Through Music ebook. I tried writing it more like the conversation I wish I had with myself, you know, writing for the kid who wanted to put stories first, how to think like a filmmaker, caring about letting those small ideas grow. And so if you want to peek into how I approach more narrative-driven music, then I left a link in the description down below. So during my conversation with Zach, I actually told him that now that he's written this, he's gone through this process, I actually think he's changed. He feels genuinely different. There's this sense of calm and serenity in how he shows up for his work in business, in his content, in his music. I think surrounding yourself in a world that you create for yourself is what can bring you joy. The processes and rituals that you create feel replenishing. They make you want to write more. I think that they fuel your momentum. I think they fuel the energy that makes you want to keep writing and actually living in this world, you know, instead of feeling disconnected from the music or feeling burnt out. And that is the payoff. And if you were to listen through the entirety of The Call of Raven's Hollow, you would understand how and why it lands. Zach brought up how at no point was one track like significantly done before another. Instead, like as one piece was being developed, it kind of informed the others. It's like the music would shape the story. It would shape the rules of the world in real time.
Like the girls theme was probably the third thing I wrote. And so like I asked myself, why? You know, speaking of curiosity in my art, rather than just taking what sort of emerged at face value, I said, why? Why is her theme dark? You know, I couldn't, and I didn't know the answer to that for a long time. There was one night in the shower where it just clicked for me. And I was like, oh my God, I get it. I get like how this can serve the story. And so I sort of reverse engineered it.
And I think this is probably the best part about musical world building, because you're basically creating all these little Easter eggs that you're leaving for the listener. How can you weave in these different instruments and textures and little motifs across the span of this entire album? So in The Call of Raven's Hollow, Zach establishes the boys theme, the girls theme, the raven and the toy maker. And we can kind of hear how these fragments and rhythms are used as harmony and counterline somewhere.
Everything's open. I'm building out this thing. I just did an instrument in here that needs to inform a track elsewhere. And so it was constantly like beefing up each of the tracks and polishing and making tweaks, listening through as a unit, like from start to finish, and saying, okay, you know, now how's the whole thing working? Like this is dragging too much here. It needs to be shorter. This is too dramatic here in context to the rest of the album. I got to dial it back. It was really like very intentionally designed to be a start to finish kind of thing.
And that's why I freaking love the final act of the album, because, you know, this is the big climactic moment, but it's not busy for the sake of just being big in scale. It literally feels like the culmination of every moment in the album leading up to this moment.
If you listen, you can hear like in the final act, there are 3 themes that are overlaid on top. There's the boys theme, which is first heard in Escaping the Workshop. Dun 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 dun. There's the girls theme, which is ba da da dum. And then there's the call, which is that starts the album. The wa dum. That happens all overlaid on top of each other at that like refrain part in the final act.
So by the time you actually get there, it feels well earned. And for me, this album was truly something special. Like, I know Zach, I'm friends with him, but it really meant a lot being invited into this world that he was creating for himself for months leading up to the release. So I think if composers can focus more on just the joy of the art instead of perfecting the technicalities of the craft, they'll feel way more connected to why they love writing in the first place. And in turn, I think you're just gonna find a lot more opportunities coming your way that are in line with the stuff that you actually enjoy. It might come in the form of more work and more gigs, but it's not the reason why you're doing it, you know? It can also just be the fun and fulfilling opportunities that you probably wouldn't have imagined otherwise. So if you're like me and you wanna keep obsessing over the story, then don't forget to pick up my Storytelling Through Music ebook. And if you wanna watch my full conversation with Zach, plus bonus resources, music feedback, hang out with me on monthly live calls, then definitely check out my Composer Odyssey membership in the description as well. But for now, if you're feeling stuck or disconnected from the music, then just step away from the DAW and surround yourself with the movies, the music, the stories that inspired you in the first place.